Meet the driver, Julien Gerbi. Hello, Julien.
Hello, Sofia.
Thank you to be here with us. So I want to ask you how your passion for speed started.
As far as I remember, I've been wanting to drive race car since when I was a little kid. So not exactly when it started, but it was from very little.
And you started with karting?
No, I did not race karting because my family could not afford it. So we waited that I would be an adult to look for some budget and start
to
racing
achieve
cars.
your dreams.
Exactly.
Okay. So there is a driver that inspired your career or yourself?
Yes, my family was very close to Roberto Moreno. So I basically grew very close to him, close to his family. So he was my reference and my idol at the time.
There is a circuit that you love the most?
Actually, I love Le Mans. It was very nice. I raced here 2 years ago.
Here comes the queue up behind Julien Gerbi.
And also I raced 2 years in the US, and Watkins Glen was a very special track to race on.
So is there any circuit that you would like to do in the future?
I would have loved to do Monaco, but I think that's not for me. It's finished. And I really wanted to do Abu Dhabi, and I raced there a couple of years ago, and it was absolutely fantastic.
Amazing.
Further contact, James Wetland tries to tough it out, but Gerbi has made that move and makes it to the lead.
How you fit yourself to be a driver?
In my situation, it's a little bit tricky because managing and owning the race team, we have a lot of workshop hours, and I usually train in the morning before going to the workshop. I built a gym at my house, and I'm just training there.
So you do cardio?
I do cardio, I do upper body, legs, neck, whatever I can in the short time I have before going to the office.
And do you train mentally?
Not so much, but after 20 years in motor racing, I hope that my mental is
Focused.
fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Two coming out of Roussel corner.
Great move there from Julien Gerbi around the outside.
When you race as a driver, you race with different nationalities?
Well, I'm from different origins. I have French and Algerian ancestors. I was born in France, so I did represent France. I did represent Algeria, which is very keen to my heart. And I have a Spanish passport, so I also somehow represent Spain.
So you are an international driver.
Very international.
I love it.
Julien Gerbi, par l'extérieur, très joli.
Can you please show me your helmet?
Of course. So, Stilo model,
Yeah.
Italian brand.
Very yellow.
Yes, Roberto Moreno inspiration. Basically, Roberto had this helmet with yellow and blue stripes, feathers. So I took a design which is very similar, just adapted it a bit, and I kept it since more than 20 years. So
Wow,
recognizable.
so it's always your color.
Any cars that I've been driving, I had this helmet design. So you
Same
can,
design, same colors.
same design, same color. You can spot me very easily throughout all my career.
I love it. Thank you for being with us, and see you in the next episode on Meet the Driver.